This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
You two, eh? Quite a good scene, isn't it? One man crazy, three very sane spectators.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. That was a scene from the iconic 1931 horror film Frankenstein, the story, of course, of a young doctor whose medical experiments on dead bodies lead to the creation of a terrible monster. The scene I played for you is one of the most famous ones from the movie. It's the scene where Dr. Frankenstein actually reanimates the monster. He's in his lab, and there's all the weird kind of electricity moving around and the dials and the knobs and the beakers. And he's got a couple people there that are actually observing this experiment. And so the monster gets hoisted to the roof, and you heard all the thunder and lightning in the background, and then a lightning bolt hits it, and it brings this previously dead flesh back to life. And of course, they bring the body back down, and there's that iconic line delivered by Colin Clive, "It's alive! It's alive!" Now, the story behind Frankenstein is actually pretty fascinating. It's based on an 1818 book by a woman named Mary Shelley. And Shelley came up with this story at the tender age of 19. She was basically in Switzerland, and she's kind of hanging out with her soon-to-be husband. He was her lover at the time. There's another man there named Lord Byron, who becomes one of England's greatest romantic poets. And so they're all kind of hanging out, these young teenagers, and they decide to have a ghost storytelling competition. Let's see who can tell the best ghost story. And so Lord Byron seems to be doing well, and he's constantly saying, okay, did you come up with anything today? Did you come up with anything today? And so finally the young Shelley hits upon this idea of Frankenstein. Now, Frankenstein is often credited with being one of the first science fiction stories, mixing in these fascinations about new technology, and of course, the anxiety that often accompanies new technologies. And living here at the beginning of the 21st century, we're not strangers to this phenomenon, right? How many movies, how many stories have we seen? Man uses the power of science to unlock some amazing idea. Think about something like Jurassic Park, like, wow, we could figure out DNA and resurrect dinosaurs. Wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't that be awesome? And then it all goes horribly wrong. There's a whole bunch of movies about zombies, right? The zombie apocalypse starts because human beings are messing around with various formulas, various chemicals, right? And so we bring back the dead, and oops, it all goes terribly wrong. But Frankenstein is more than just a horror novel. It's actually an early example of what we might call romantic literature, which was part of a movement and a moment that rejected the Enlightenment principles of reason and rationality, that emphasized the value of spirituality, of emotion, and of the heroic individual. And we can see some of these trends emerge in the complex psychology of Shelley's monster, which is a little bit different than the one that you and I know from the movies, right? There's obviously the 1931 version of Frankenstein, but that kind of idea of the scientific monster, you create him and now all he wants is violence. That's actually not quite the monster that Shelley creates. There's a much deeper psychological layer to Shelley's Frankenstein than the one that we're used to from cartoons and movies and things like that. For one thing, Shelley's monster actually is intelligent. He can talk in complete sentences. He's fully literate. There's none of this, kind of noise that you hear from like Robert De Niro's version of Frankenstein that he once played. At the same time, Shelley's Frankenstein is not just inherently violent or full of rage, but has a kind of deep grievance that produces the violence. One of the big differences is in Shelley's Frankenstein, as soon as Dr. Frankenstein creates the monster, he basically abandons it. He looks at it, he sees the kind of hideousness of it externally, physically, and finds it revolting and kind of just runs away. And so it's actually the physical repulsion and the sense of rejection that then drives the creature's misery and rage. At another point in the book, he basically starts living next to this family. He kind of becomes sympathetic to the family. He actually saves the family at one point, helps them out. And this generosity is then repaid by the family reacting with horror. They basically just see him. They scream, monster. One of their friends actually shoots him at one point. And so again, the monster's frustrations are not born of just a natural inclination to violence. They're a reaction to the failures of human beings. Later on, the monster actually goes up to Dr. Frankenstein. He kind of tracks him down and he says, look, I'm unhappy. You left me. I feel miserable and rejected. All I want, though, is a companion. Just create a female monster for me. And the two of us, we can live our lives in happiness and we'll just be apart. And so Dr. Frankenstein agrees to this, but then he later betrays the monster because he's worried about, well, what if they start having baby monsters? And, I don't want to cause the downfall of civilization here. And so the end of the book is basically this vendetta, where basically the monster says, I am going to exact revenge upon you, Frankenstein, because you have betrayed me. So there's a deep sense of vengeance that's animating the story. It's less a tale about the dangers of science than it is the failures of the enlightened man. And Dr. Frankenstein is an enlightened guy. He's a doctor. He's a man of letters, a man of science. And it's his lack of empathy that provides the undoing for the story, not necessarily his arrogance and his willingness to kind of transcend normal boundaries, the way that it's often told in the modern version of the story. We start our episode today with this discussion of Frankenstein because it illustrates some of the major themes that we'll explore today in our lecture, particularly the reaction against the Enlightenment that became manifest in European society during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, some of you, especially those of you that have listened to our podcast on the Enlightenment, you might be saying, well, what's wrong with the Enlightenment? This idea that, maybe we could rationalize society, maybe we could educate people and emancipate them, could free them from dependence on other institutions. That all sounds pretty good to me. Looking around at life here in the 21st century, especially in America, wouldn't a little bit more reason and rationality be helpful? Wouldn't that be a good thing? But the question is, can you go too far? What do we do about the things in our personality traits, in our culture, in our society? What do we do about those things that are not rational, that are irrational? Some children like to sleep with the light on. It's not rational. They don't need it. There's no monsters under the bed. But so what if they want to do that? Why do we all have to conform to some reasonable standard that says no one can have the light on at night because there might be monsters? What if people just like having ice cream for breakfast? It's not rational. It's not a good idea. There's definitely health consequences that will flow from that. Where does freedom fit into this story? What if I want to do things that are irrational? What if I want to do things that don't make sense? Don't I, as an individual, have the right to make those decisions for myself? The enlightened man or woman is supposed to have reason eliminate all of their flaws, to basically become a polished or finalized or finished product. But what happens if we all get polished or rationalized in the same way? Don't we begin to lose something? don't we begin to lose our sense of individuality? I mean, ants are thoroughly rationalized. Life in an ant colony is heavily regulated. They all do kind of the right thing. They all do what they're supposed to do. And where is the individuality for an ant or a bee or, whatever example from nature that you want to use? Doesn't our individuality matter? And is there a danger that too much reason, too much rationality can overcome or suppress it? This is the heart of the Romantic critique of the enlightened, rationalized world that was built before and then during the French Revolution. So in today's episode, we'll look more closely at some of these fundamental contradictions inherent in the Enlightenment, and we'll note how the Enlightenment eventually provoked this counter-reaction by Romanticism. Now, before we get too deep into the question of what is the Romantic movement and what are some of its manifestations, it's a good idea to kind of begin our discussion by pointing out some of those flaws associated with the Enlightenment. We're talking here not just about flaws in the sense of, the social leveling that I just mentioned, but there are some areas where the Enlightenment is inherently contradictory, where there are sort of massive problems between what it wants and what it says its goals are, and then the realities that are being created on the ground. And a really great example of this is the way that it treats this idea of religious freedom. If you remember, when we talked about the Enlightenment, we mentioned Enlightenment thinkers are very, very pro-religious freedom, pro-tolerance. They love the idea that everyone will be able to worship in their own way, to practice their own religion. And they felt that way because they saw it as a way to end some of the violence created by religious warfare in the 16th and 17th centuries. And so a really great kind of example of this is the story of Jews and Jewish emancipation, especially in Prussia. And there's a story that's written by a Saxon dramatist, but he also spent a lot of time in Prussia. His name is Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, and he wrote a famous play called Nathan the Wise in 1779. Now, the play tells the story of this clever Jewish merchant, obviously named Nathan, who seeks to navigate the complexities of religious difference in Jerusalem during the period of the Third Crusade. So the plot itself is kind of complicated. Nathan has a foster daughter named Rekha, and at one point there's a fire at his house. He's not home, and so there's this Christian knight or Templar who comes in and saves her from the fire. And then, of course, as in all these stories, as soon as the boy sees the girl, he wants to marry her, she wants to marry him, and so there's this kind of love angle to it that then gets more complicated. Basically, it turns out that Rekha, the daughter, was not born Jewish, but was born a Christian. And so then the Templar, feels this sense of outrage. You're not supposed to be crossing religious boundaries in this period. The Christian community is not supposed to be proselytized to by Jews. Jews are not supposed to be proselytizing anyways. Now, there's a lot of plot twists in this play, and I don't want to give away the ending. But the most important part of the play, from our perspective, for the Enlightenment's perspective, is this moment when Nathan the Wise is brought before the Sultan, Saladin. And Saladin wants to kind of test, how wise are you really? Let me figure this out. And so Saladin says to him, there's these three great religions in the world, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Which is the true religion? They all kind of share this heritage. They all kind of view each other as related. Or at least we could say that the later religions look at the previous religion as being kind of related. They see themselves as building off of those traditions. And so obviously this puts Nathan in a really difficult situation. Nathan is Jewish. He's supposed to say, according to his own beliefs, Judaism is the best religion. But you don't exactly go in front of the Sultan and say, oh, hey, Sultan, guess what? You're a heathen. Guess what? You're ignorant. You're wrong. You don't know God. So how's he going to talk his way out of this? Well, Nathan does so by telling a story. And this story is known as the parable of the ring. He says once upon a time, there was this dad, and he had 3 kids. And he loved all 3 of their sons. He loved all 3 of his sons equally. Now, this dad also happened to possess a magic ring. And he knew that when he died, all 3 sons would want the ring. And so instead of leaving it to one or having them fight over it, the dad had 2 exact replicas of the ring made. And so when he died, each of the sons got one of the rings. How do we know which ring is real and which ring is fake? The answer, Nathan said, could only be discovered by each son believing that they had the real ring. And over the course of time, events and reason would reveal whichever son had the actual true ring. And so the message there is pretty obvious. You believe what you think is right. I'll believe what I'll think is right. And we'll just have to see. And nobody really knows. And so you could be right, or I could be right, or the Templar could be right. We'll just have to see. This sounds like tremendous words of wisdom, and in some ways it is, right? This is the bedrock of a tolerant, enlightened society. This is why, in the United States and most other liberal democracies, why you have the ability to practice the freedom of religion. You do your thing, I'll do mine, and in the end, we'll all see how it ends up, right? Either I'll end up in heaven or maybe hell or whatever, but I'll just live my life and you live yours, and we won't have violence now on earth. But beneath the surface of this triumphant story, there are certain problems. For one, what does it mean to Nathan to be Jewish? If you actually read the play, Nathan identifies as Jewish, but his actual behavior is pretty much the same as everybody else's. We never see him observing Jewish practices or rituals. He doesn't pray or speak in Hebrew. He does not keep kosher. And for reasons discussed in the play, he's not even raising his sort of foster daughter to be Jewish. So his Jewishness is one that exists primarily in name, or perhaps we might say in identity, but he does not really appear all that different than any of the other characters. They're almost interchangeable. And that is because they have had all of their particularities, their cultural or religious particularities, stripped away because they have become so rational. Now, the story of Nathan the Wise is not just fictional and metaphoric, but it's born out of practice by individual Jews who lived through the period. Nathan's character, for example, was modeled on a man named Moses Mendelssohn, who lives in Berlin in the mid-18th century. Mendelssohn was born to a poor family in Germany. He's a brilliant man. He's largely self-educated. And so he kind of starts off with a more religious angle to his education, but later on he gets involved in philosophy, in mathematics, in literature. But he is not lacking in courage. One of the things he does is he actually publishes a criticism of Friedrich the Great's poetry. Friedrich the Great, Enlightenment guy, yes, I'm king, but I'm also going to dabble in some poetry on the side. Mendelssohn says, hey, I believe in merit. Your poetry isn't that good. More importantly, another thing that Mendelssohn does is he founds a German language newspaper, and he begins to engage in conversations with other German intellectuals about core Enlightenment era issues, including, but not limited to, this question of toleration. One of his most important contributions is he strikes up a conversation with this Prussian civil servant named Christian Wilhelm Dohm, D-O-H-M. And Dohm turns around in 1781 and writes this pamphlet on the civic improvement of the Jews. And on the civic improvement of the Jews makes a powerful case for Jewish emancipation. Makes a powerful case saying, look, we in Prussian society, we Christians, we should give Jews the same rights that we have. They should be able to be public officials. They shouldn't have to pay special taxes. They shouldn't have to be limited in terms of where they live. And from an enlightened perspective, that makes a lot of sense, right? We're all about breaking down barriers. We're all about having social conversations. We're all about kind of unlocking and emancipating individuals. So on the surface, many of us today look at this and say, this is progress. This is reason. If we were writing a sort of history of Europe as this continual march of reason and rationality over superstition and hatred and violence, Moses Mendelssohn and Nathan the Wise are going to figure pretty prominently in that story. But there's still a problem here. Dohm is not writing on the civic improvement of the Jews because he thinks that Jews are equal to Christians and he thinks that everybody should just be the same, or have equality, to use a word from modern parlance. He wants Jews basically to give up their particularity. Many Enlightenment thinkers, even though they advocated for religious toleration, they didn't do it because they believed in the idea of equality. They did it because they thought that those restrictions and limitations were actually causing pernicious behavior. Someone like Friedrich the Great doesn't think that Jews are equal. He calls them locusts. He says that they harm Christian trade, and he imposes a series of religious-based political restrictions. In Prussia, Jews are subject to a body tax that is otherwise only levied against cows. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine if we said, this particular group in society, they have to pay the same tax that you pay if you own a cow, because they're just like cows, essentially. Jews are only able to enter the city of Berlin at 2 specifically designated gates. And unlike every other community in Prussia, Jews are liable to collective punishment. So if there is a criminal who happens to be Jewish, the entire Jewish community can be fined or punished for that person's behavior. How is that equality? And just to play it out a little bit more, there are these stereotypes about Jews as being avaricious, greedy. They stem from basically the fact that in medieval society, Christians were not allowed to loan money to each other. And so that kind of gap was filled by Jews who could commit usury, which was seen as a sin. But that since they were Jews, they were going to hell anyway, so the Christians didn't care. Someone like Dom is suggesting that the restrictions on Jews be abolished, not because he really believes that they're equal, but because he hopes that once you get rid of those restrictions, they'll drop all of these particularities. They'll stop having this kosher diet. They'll stop dressing in these ways that are weird. They'll stop living in the ghetto together and only marrying other Jews, even though there is actually a decent amount of intermarriage going on during this period. But the idea behind the reform is not based on the idea of equality. It's baked the prejudice into the system, so to speak. This is not the only area where we see these kind of massive contradictions between Enlightenment values and practices. If we had more time, censorship would be another interesting one to go into. As we saw before, people like Voltaire, they hate censorship, right? We should have freedom of speech. You should have protections from government. And yet, sometimes you need to restrict speech because you need to have order. Another example of this, which we're going to go into in a different podcast on human freedom and slavery, is the idea of race. Now, obviously, if we're talking about race, which then becomes a justification for slavery, there's some pretty big contradictions there with Enlightenment ideals. The Enlightenment is literally all about self-emancipation. How can you be emancipated if you're literally in chains, in shackles? If you don't have the freedom of movement? But there's another way to look at race where race becomes in many ways the perfect embodiment of Enlightenment thinking. Go back to the lecture that we had on the Enlightenment. One of the things that the Enlightenment did was it said, oh, there's all these kind of hidden social laws out there. And if we can unlock these social laws, if we can find these hidden patterns, if we can find the gravity associated with population growth, well, then we can use that to create better outcomes for our populations, our states, our people, whatever. Well, are there these hidden, unseen laws that apply to human beings? How can we tell? Well, we need to classify them. We need to observe them. We need to kind of look at all this data, produce all this data, and then see if there's any patterns that emerge. And that's essentially what the Enlightenment ideal of race becomes. Well, let's go ahead and look and see. Well, let's base our observations on especially visual elements, on skin color, on hair color, on eye color. Later on, they also start inventing these other ideas like cranial size. Let's look at the measurements on your face, your height of your face versus the width of your face versus the depth of your face. But let's start coming up with observations, and then we'll look to see if we can make classifications. And that's essentially what they do. Once you have the classifications, it's a very short step to then say, well, these people that have this skin color, we associate with these cultural and social behaviors. This creates a paradox. You're judging people based on their physical appearance and then eventually using that to deny them freedom. So we'll go into this, as I said, in another episode, and we'll see that actually the real impetus for getting rid of slavery comes not from Enlightenment thinkers, who are not exclusively for race, but many of them are. Many of them will actually defend slavery. But it actually comes from the Quakers and the sort of the spark, if you will, that ignites the fire of abolitionism comes from a realization that slavery leads people to sin. So in some cases, it's not actually about the slaves themselves and freedom. It's about what slavery does to the captors from a religious and moral standpoint. But as I said, we'll get into that in a different episode. Now, again, before we get into art, and I promise I will get there towards the end of the episode, I want to note three major European thinkers that basically by the late 18th century, while they had some impulses that were pro-Enlightenment, they also began to develop critiques of the Enlightenment. They began to develop arguments as to ways that it can be improved or ways that perhaps we should complement it and balance it. The first one of these guys is from Switzerland. His name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he grows up in a poor family in Geneva. He kind of leads this maladjusted life. He leaves home when he's 16, kind of never looks back. He's kind of, many of us have met people like this in life where they're just kind of loners. They're just kind of never really happy as part of a group. And so that's Rousseau. He's like the perfect cultural critic because he kind of isolates himself from society for periods of time and kind of wants to distance himself, at least from what's popular in time. If only Jean-Jacques Rousseau could have had a podcast back in the day, he would have been enormously popular. Now, Rousseau, as I said, there are parts of Rousseau's thinking that are very pro-Enlightenment. He is a huge believer in the notion of tolerance. He is a huge believer in the concept of human freedom and natural rights. But he's also highly critical of existing European society, and not just the part where we had feudalism and kings and privilege. His critique goes further and gets into a kind of moral and spiritual realm. One of the things that Rousseau says is that if we want to think about morality, the place to start is not in high concepts and rationality and tutors and things like that, but it starts in nature. Think about it for a moment. What are the most important character traits that a person can have? What are the most important things that you can demonstrate as virtues or values? Is it not moral attributes like kindness, unselfishness, honesty? How do you learn to be honest? I mean, yes, you can learn it in part through kind of modeling off your parents, but honesty is really something that's kind of born with you, isn't it? Or unselfishness. You don't go to school and the teacher says, okay, now you need to be honest. And you say, oh, okay, the teacher told me I should be honest. The people told me I should be kind to my sister, to my brother, to my, friends, to the other students. Okay, I'll do it. Most of that stuff just kind of innately grows up with us, right? Your ability to be a hard worker. It's not that someone told you during your life, you need to work hard. It's that you just kind of grew up and had that as an innate part of your personality. And so when Rousseau looks out at the world, he says, nature is not a machine that we need to conquer and kind of tame. And if you think about like the gardens and you have the sort of wild garden with all the weeds and things. And then, the Enlightenment thinker comes along and says, let's order that. Let's rationalize it. Rousseau says, no, actually, there was something really important in that garden that we really don't want to lose. Maybe instead of trying to sort of control nature, maybe we should just go out in nature and enjoy it and think about it and allow nature to heal us. Now, Rousseau also kind of drifts into this idea of this kind of romantic idea of nature when he talks about private property as well. Rousseau in some ways anticipates or gives grounding to later on the socialists and communists. One of the things that he says is that basically this quest to gain more and more land has disrupted the social harmony that primitive societies had. If you think about the Native Americans running around on the American plains, they don't have private property. They're not fighting with each other, in theory, over land and over resources and things like that. Now, of course, as individuals, they weren't. But as we know, the tribes themselves did fight with each other. They were in contest for land. So Rousseau's notion of nature here is a little bit primitive, is a little bit romantic. The third thing that Rousseau kind of preaches is this idea of direct democracy. Again, he likes this idea of primitive societies. He likes this idea of small societies, small communities. And so one of the things that he begins to advocate for is this idea of direct democracy. Instead of having some champion kind of hoisted on you, as someone like Thomas Hobbes would say, or selecting that person to be hoisted on you, as maybe John Locke would argue, he says, actually, what we do is we realize that nature can be very difficult, so we band together in societies. But when we do that, what we're basically doing is we are giving a portion of ourselves to this collective, but the collective isn't the property of some ruler. The collective is really what we might call the general will. There's this collective mentality, this collective agreement that we all sort of share in or buy into. And so really what we want in a perfect society is to kind of manage it ourselves. We want a democratic society, and we want the kind of leadership to respond to this general will, not to be thinking about what are their own interests or how are they going to manage the situation based on their own kind of private initiatives. You can see in some ways why someone like Rousseau would have been enormously popular during the French Revolution. He's not quite well known before it. There's some debate about that. But once the revolution really gets going by the 1790s, Rousseau seems like the guy who has figured it out. He seems like the guy who's giving the kind of spiritual and intellectual and philosophical grounding for a democratic society. However, as we saw during our episode on the French Revolution, one of the problems with the general will is how do we figure out what the general will actually is? If you take a poll in basically any democratic society about most issues that are being debated, should we raise taxes? Should we lower taxes? Should we have more immigration, less immigration? Should we invest more in the military or in schools? There's not a general will that says, it's clearly the answer is X. Right? So the general will, it's hard to work that out. In the United States and in other liberal democracies, the answer to that question has become institutions. You have elections. The elections produce parliaments. Parliaments then vote. Legislatures vote. Sometimes you have checks and balances. Sometimes a president. Sometimes a prime minister. But there's a system to kind of work us through to figure out what the general will actually is. As we saw during the French Revolution, that system didn't exist yet. And that's one of the reasons that we have all of that violence. Now, a second major critique of the Enlightenment is made by a Prussian philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And Kant is perhaps one of the most important philosophers of the modern period. And if there's like a top three or something like that, he's probably in that conversation as to who the top three philosophers of the modern era would be. Kant is also from a poor family, but he works his way up the sort of academic ladder. He goes from being a private lecturer to a university professor. In 1781, he publishes a Critique of Pure Reason, which is a response to the growing doubts about the Enlightenment going on in Europe at the time. Now, there's obviously a lot in a Critique of Pure Reason, but there's two things that I want to mention just briefly that'll give you an idea of, again, some of these contradictions, some of these problems with the Enlightenment project when understood as being kind of exclusive and total. The first argument that Kant makes is that we have this thing called metaphysics. Metaphysics is the idea that there is knowledge out there that you cannot perceive through your senses. If we wanted to argue, for example, that God exists, we could do so, but you can't prove that God exists using the five senses. I can't speak to God in the same way that I could speak to another person. I can't hear God or feel God or taste God in the same way that I could food or another human being or a horse or whatever. The second issue that came up was what he called antinomies. And antinomies were the idea that reason itself could lead to contradiction. If I said to you that the universe definitely has a beginning, I could lay out a variety of rational and reasoned arguments as to why that must be the case. If I said at the same time, the universe has always existed, I could also construct a very strong case based on facts, observations, reason, logic. One of those must be wrong. The universe cannot have always existed and yet also have a beginning. And yet, as Kant would point out, reason can't fix that problem. You can't rationalize your way through that to come to a clear answer. And so again, what Kant is basically saying is that the Enlightenment is flawed. It has slight problems and contradictions that need to be worked out. Okay, our third major thinker in this line of succession was a Protestant theologian named J.G. Herder, Herder, who lived in the middle to late 18th century. And Herder was actually one of Kant's students, and so he grew up with this kind of suspicion about the Enlightenment, this kind of doubts, if you will. And in the end, he kind of rejected this notion of conformity. Herder especially reacted to the French dominance of the Enlightenment. If we're thinking about Enlightenment culture, a lot of it is coming out of the city of Paris. A lot of it is coming from French thinkers like Denis Diderot, from people like Voltaire, Montesquieu. And so Herder is German, and he has a kind of negative reaction to it. And so he basically develops this idea that people are naturally bound to their local cultures. In other words, that as you as an individual are growing up in a society, you have an organic connection to this thing called the nation, to the community that you grow up in, to especially the language that you grow up in. Herder would say, you growing up speaking German, that gives you a certain mindset that might be different than, say, someone from Croatia, or someone from Italy, or someone from Buenos Aires. And so Herder, again, kind of begins to develop this idea of a national culture. He says, a community without a common spirit will fall ill and die. A fatherland without inhabitants who love it will become a desert. Thus, this whole idea of the Enlightenment, of complete rationalism, of everyone is going to take the Code Napoleon and they're all going to use it because it's the most rational, the best ideas, and perfect for everybody, one size fits all. Herder says, I reject that because there's a value in particularity. There's a value in the way that someone who is Slavic thinks versus someone that's German. And just to be clear, he does not believe in a kind of hierarchy, right? He's not into classifying everyone and then ordering it, deciding these, cultural traits that flow from it. He would say, look, someone who is Slavic, they need to be Slavic. If you're Polish, you need to have Polish as your mother tongue. We should be protecting that. We should be encouraging that. There's a kind of healthy, spiritual, emotional, he wouldn't use this word, but we would today, to say a psychological value to belonging and having roots in your own national culture. Herder's writings become tremendously influential, and they actually go beyond just the world of academia. Some of you might be familiar with the Grimm brothers. Of course, they're running around Germany slightly after Herder, collecting stories of fairy tales from the peasants, putting them together into these kind of standardized editions, and then everyone is supposed to grow up German reading these fairy tales because they say something about being German. The Grimm brothers are a product of this movement that kind of starts with Herder. And then obviously there's some other figures attached to that as well. Okay, so far we've been talking a lot about the Enlightenment, about various philosophers and intellectuals, and some of you are probably like, I wanted to listen to this episode because I thought it was about art. Why are we still talking about intellectual figures? Get to the art part. Okay, I hear you. Let's talk about art. But before we get into what is actually romantic art, we need to understand better Neo-classicism, which was the style of art that existed right beforehand. Because Romanticism is essentially a giant rejection of neoclassical style. Now, Neoclassicism, as the name would suggest, is kind of based on this idea of looking at Greco-Roman values, Greco-Roman art styles, and kind of incorporating that into the 18th century. The selection of Greco-Roman art is not accidental. It is, in fact, a product of the Enlightenment. We've talked about the Enlightenment quite a bit, and we've noted that one of the things that the Enlightenment is saying is, let's have self-emancipation, let's have individuals, let's focus on virtue and kind of trying to encourage that again. And it's always easy to kind of come up with these values and come up with these sort of ideologies, but to actually make that understandable or comprehensible for other people is often very difficult. We saw this with the scientific revolution. You have a guy like Johannes Kepler, he's come up with all his theories, he's come up with all his laws of planetary motion, but they can only go so far because it's really hard to understand mathematics at that level. What we needed to really get the scientific revolution going was someone like Galileo, who could say, here, look at my telescope. See those weird shapes on the moon? Clearly, we need an explanation for this that goes beyond Aristotle. So the Enlightenment thinkers, as the Enlightenment is being born, are also kind of thinking about how do we express this? How do we transfer these values to the rest of society? And one of the ways that we express our values is through history. It's one of the reasons that history is so fundamentally important beyond just this idea of let's not repeat the mistakes that we've made in the past. There's a real social value to understanding history because historical symbols have such power. Here in the United States, the idea of Abraham Lincoln, okay, yes, there was the historical Lincoln, there's the things he did, but there's a powerful symbolism in someone like Abraham Lincoln, in someone like Martin Luther King Jr., in someone like Adolf Hitler in a negative way. And so as the Enlightenment thinkers are kind of thinking about, okay, what historical models can we use to kind of base our project on, it's very natural for them to look back and say, the Republican period of ancient Rome is the perfect society. Someone like Cicero, who's talking and writing about these values of a Republican society, of a rule of law, of the dangers of dictatorship. Someone like Cicero is perfect as a role model. Someone like the ancient Roman general Cincinnatus, this guy who's a farmer and there's a crisis, and so he kind of comes out of retirement. He leads the defense of Rome. They end the crisis. They win. And then as soon as he's done, he says, great, we won. Okay, I'm going to go back to being a farmer. That idea of civic virtue appeals tremendously to someone like George Washington and other members of the American Revolution. And so as the Enlightenment really starts to get going, they will seize upon Greco-Roman art, especially from the Republican or the Democratic periods in those two sort of historical periods. Key moment along the way that I should mention for those of you that are interested in the history of art is Johann Joachim Winckelmann's History of Ancient Art, which is published in 1764. And while that title probably doesn't strike you as too revolutionary, it was actually one of the first books to separate Greek and Roman art into separate periods. And this is a key point, right? The art that works well for the Roman Empire is not going to work well until we get to Napoleon's time, because it's not about the democratic values anymore. It's more going back to this idea of a heroic conqueror. But for our purposes, Winckelmann's texts are profound in a number of ways, one of which is because he just makes art, and especially Greco-Roman art, popular again. He creates this kind of demand and interest in it that will explode as we get into the 1770s and 1780s. Again, part of the reason for this is that Winckelmann goes beyond just saying art is art for art's sake, it's there for beauty, it's there to display wealth. You know, I'm some kind of wealthy noble, let me commission an artist to paint my family or to paint some kind of mythical scene and I'll hang it up in my castle. Winckelmann argues that art should display and convey virtue. And if you're talking about the Enlightenment and its kind of own self-understanding, it's all about the idea of virtue. Let us develop virtuous citizens. Let us have these virtuous conversations in society. And so as you get into the Enlightenment, art becomes tremendously important. It's not just decorative, it's not just aesthetic, it fulfills a political function. And we'll see that in just a second when we talk about art during the French Revolution. The other really important thing that Winckelmann kind of says is that there is a power in simplicity. That beautiful art is not just the art that has the most swirls on the canvas or the loudest noise or the most movements. the simple can be beautiful. You think about something like Michelangelo's David, right? This statue, it's supposed to be the beautiful statue that's in Florence. It's not a complicated statue, but it's beautiful. There's a power in its simplicity. And so this is also one of the ideas that Winckelmann helps contribute to. So again, as we get into this period of Neoclassicism, one of the things it does is it gets rid of the Rococo style's emphasis on luxuriousness. If you go and look at art from the first half of the 18th century, you'll notice there's a lot of curves. It's kind of very Baroque. There's a lot of just kind of extra stuff thrown in, whether it's clouds or wisps or something like this. Nymphs and satyrs and leaves and all kinds of kind of just extra elementary decorative stuff that's thrown in. Neoclassical art will try to rationalize the landscape. It prizes straight lines, clear shapes. They love painting about Republican themes, especially Roman Republican themes. Perhaps a really easy way to understand neoclassical art is to think about any one of a number of structures that are built in the neoclassical style. We're talking here about the U.S. Capitol, Monticello, the Pantheon in Paris, the British Museum in London, or the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. What do all of these kind of buildings have in common with each other? Well, they all have lots and lots of Greco-Roman columns in them. Many of them have a kind of triangular or rectangular at the top of the building, a kind of triangular rectangular shape to the top of their buildings. They're largely symmetrical, and they're built out of stone or marble. They're all highly geometric and all highly abstract. And for the most part, they look like buildings that if you just picked them up and stuck them down in, let's say, ancient Rome in the year 200 BC, most of them would look very appropriate there, right? Think about the U.S. Capitol, take the rotunda dome off the top. How is that different than the Parthenon in Athens? Obviously, one is still intact and the other one got blown up, but for the most part, they look pretty similar. And that's, of course, because they're all part of this neoclassical style. In terms of painting, we have a similar story. Neoclassical painters dispense with these kind of broad brushstrokes and the kind of wispiness of a Rococo style. Instead, they're all about straight lines, geometric angles, and one of the really fascinating parts about it is that they structure the canvas. If you look at a neoclassical painting, the lines in the painting should either run up and down, they should be horizontal, or they can be diagonal. But you don't really see curves. You don't really see odd angles. Everything should be at kind of a 45 or a 90-degree angle in almost the entire painting. And so if you look at some of them, you get these kind of weird angles. People will be talking and they'll have their hand up at a 45-degree angle in a weird way, or they'll have their hands on their hips kind of making these triangles. And so neoclassical art is really easy to see. If you want some examples of this, I would highly recommend looking at the work of Jacques-Louis David, which is spelled like David, D-A-V-I-D. And David he's not just a painter, another guy who's floating along during the French Revolution, responding to the times and the artwork of the times, the styles of the times. David is actually, in many ways, very political. He serves in the National Assembly. He actually is one of the deputies that votes for the regicide, for the killing of the king. And David believes that his work is not just about, again, painting pretty pictures or creating decorations. If you went to the U.S. Capitol today, you go inside, you'll see, okay, there's nice decorations, there's paintings of famous moments, maybe in American history. But David really sees his work as pieces of propaganda or as conveying a sort of message. They're supposed to tell viewers about duty, about honor, about patriotism, about the virtue of reason. So his paintings become legendary. Now, an interesting thing happened. So I mentioned he's kind of a Jacobin. He's caught up in the French Revolution in its most extreme phases. He and Robespierre are very close. After the fall of Robespierre, Napoleon Bonaparte recognizes that he's a great painter, and so he kind of keeps him on and allows him to focus more on painting than on politics. But he doesn't go away. David remained popular through the Napoleonic period until the Restoration in 1815, and then his star kind of wanes a little bit and he goes into exile and then dies. But again, he was much more than just a painter. I highly recommend that you go online, Google his name, and check out some of his paintings. Finally, the last little piece that I want to mention about the neoclassical style is an interesting way that it got expressed in terms of fashion. We tend not to think much about fashion, and especially when we do in the 18th century, we think about like especially women's clothing. The women are wearing these giant kind of skirts. They're actually like kind of building whalebones, using whalebones. They build these kind of hoops underneath it. Some of the pictures are almost laughable about how could you fit through a doorway with these enormous skirts? Of course, the most notorious piece of clothing from this period is the corset. There's all these movies where people are fainting, and that really happened in real life because basically it crushed a woman's chest, crushed her diaphragm. It was very hard for her to breathe. And one of the interesting things that happens as we get into this neoclassical period is that they obviously didn't dress like that in ancient Rome. And so they kind of set all that aside for about 15, 20 years, and they embrace the toga, or a toga-like garment. And so you see women wearing these very natural-looking, very kind of white, almost like a robe, or again, a toga is a good kind of example of it. And so that's what women wear for about 20 years. And it's very natural-looking until the Restoration happens, and then they go back to wearing, again, this kind of more encumbersome types of clothes, one might say. So we have all this rationality, we have all this reason, we have all this structure, and against this, there forms this kind of artistic reaction, which again is known as the Romantic movement, which we've been talking about basically through the podcast today. And it's not hard to imagine why people wanted to react against this, right? At some point, don't we get sick of listening to the same stories of the same Greco-Roman heroes? At some point, doesn't the idea that you have to paint within the numbers, doesn't that become boring? Doesn't that become stifling? Don't we as human beings, don't we long to transcend boundaries? And so this is the spark that leads to this romantic reaction that kind of builds in the latter third of the 18th century. Artists start casting aside all this Greco-Roman stuff, and they start to say, hey, you know what? The Middle Ages was pretty interesting too. In fact, the Middle Ages is not this period of darkness and superstition. Most of you have probably heard the Middle Ages referred to as the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages. Rome fell, and then for 1,000 years, no one knew what to do anymore, and it was just awful. Romantic thinkers start to say, hey, you know what? Actually, that's not true. There's another side to the story of the Middle Ages that isn't just the decline and fall of Rome. There is also this tremendous birth of spirituality, of emotion, of a close proximity to nature. Now, I should note, too, that these are kind of stereotypical views of the Middle Ages. There's a lot of reason and rationality and building sort of institutions and structures during the Middle Ages that's phenomenally important. But in this kind of stereotypical view, of course, these things get kind of left out. And so Enlightenment thinkers tend to look down on the Middle Ages. Romantic thinkers seem to look up to it, seem to say that's actually when we had this sort of formational moment in our national cultures. That's when we have these positive things going on. We can see this artistic rebellion start in architecture in a variety of ways, but the most obvious way is the return of the Gothic. The Gothic was kind of the high and late medieval form of architecture, believed in a lot of arches, believed in a lot of like stained glass windows, a lot of decorative elements. It was kind of showing off this sophistication that they had achieved in terms of architecture and sort of structural architecture, which had gone far beyond what the Romans or Greeks had done. And so a great example of this is the story of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Now, of course, the Cathedral of Notre Dame had existed by this point for many, many centuries. It had been around for a long time. It was kind of the popular church, if you will, or cathedral for the king. He had his own private kind of cathedral that he used, but when he wanted sort of public events, that was the place to go. During the French Revolution, the Cathedral of Notre Dame basically falls into disrepair. It gets picked up a little bit for Napoleon when he crowns himself emperor, but for the most part, by the time you get to the 1820s, it's falling apart. The stained glass windows are broken. It's fallen into disuse. And then a French author named Victor Hugo in the anglicized version of it, Victor Hugo writes this book called The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1831. And the story, forget the Disney version for a moment, the story is not so much about Quasimodo, this hunchback guy that works there. The story is really about the cathedral itself. The hero of The Hunchback of Notre Dame is the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And so after the book is published, people start saying, wait a minute, we have this artistic, this historical, this Gothic treasure. We don't want to let it fall to disuse because we're so busy building these kind of neoclassical buildings everywhere. We need to preserve it. And so they actually begin forming historical societies, forming preservation clubs, archaeological societies, and they start rebuilding and preserving and in some ways enhancing historical monuments. Another great example of this kind of Gothic revival architecture is Big Ben in the House of Parliament in the UK, in London. Take a moment to picture Big Ben. Most of us have seen it, right? The giant clock tower. What does it look like? What are the features that make Big Ben distinguishable? Isn't it all of those little extra Gothic parts of stone, the little pieces of stone, the little almost like leaves that are curled up, the gargoyles, all of those types of things that are on Big Ben, the House of Parliament, and other Gothic revival type buildings? Now, there's a number of other ways that this kind of Gothic revival happens. If you're a literature buff, literature is actually probably one of the most important and most exciting and most enduring ways that this romantic rebellion still affects us today. Many of us love a good historical novel. We love a good sort of heroic novel set back in time, story like William Wallace, which Mel Gibson famously made into Braveheart. We love these kind of stories of adventures, these stories of heroes that come from the past. One of the earliest examples of this romantic literature came from Scotland, where there was a man named James Macpherson, and he went into Scotland. He said, I'm going to recover these Gaelic stories of heroic deeds in epic poetry. Mentioned Neo-classicism. What are the artistic works that it really holds up as being amazing and powerful and symbols of the greatness of Greco-Roman culture? Well, think about heroic poetry like the Odyssey and the Iliad. So by the time you get to the middle of the 18th century, the question becomes, what is the German version of the Odyssey or the Iliad? What is the Scottish or Gaelic version of the Odyssey or the Iliad? And so in 1761, Macpherson announces that he's discovered and translated the story of Fingal, who's this sort of 3rd century Gaelic bard who's documented these series of battles and legends involving a number of mighty warriors. Now, at the time he publishes this, there's a number of contemporaries that look at it and go, this is baloney. This doesn't actually look like ancient Gaelic. You've got modern linguistic conventions going on here. You probably wrote this. And actually, most modern historians now largely agree that Macpherson basically wrote this by himself. But the stories still become wildly popular. It doesn't matter whether or not Macpherson made this up. The idea that it was true was the powerful thing. If you want another example, look at a place like Germany, where you have something called the Nibelungenlied. The Nibelungenlied is this story about this German prince, Siegfried, and he's murdered, and there's a lot of other characters that are involved. One of the interesting things about the Nibelungenlied, and some of these other stories as well, is there isn't just one Nibelungenlied. There's actually quite a few of them. There's different versions of them. As people traveled around medieval Europe, as they went to places like Iceland, places like Sweden, places like Germany, the stories changed and the versions changed. And in some cases, what happened to the heroes, or even who the heroes were, changed slightly. But none of that really matters. When you pick up a Grimm's fairy tale, you don't really care about, are there other versions of Hansel and Gretel, of Little Red Riding Hood? You like the idea that you're reading your kids a kind of organic, communal, sort of completely German story. And so we see more and more of these types of stories emerge, especially as we get into the first half of the 19th century. Another key figure was the author Walter Scott, who wrote stories of heroic deeds such as Rob Roy in 1817 and Ivanhoe in 1819. And both of these stories are set in these historic landscapes. They become opportunities to view individual virtue, to view individual heroicism. Ivanhoe in particular is set in the 12th century in England, and it's full of all these kind of fun things such as jousting, there's a witch trial, there's a lot about Jewish-Christian relations, and there's a little romance thrown in there as well. And so you have a lot going on that is different than the kind of neoclassical Enlightenment story. What makes Ivanhoe powerful is not that he uses reason. He's not like Tamino, if you want to go back to the magic flute. It's that he is individually heroic, skilled, talented, good at violence. I'll just add, too, that a lot of these books, they not only talk about the heroes, but they talk about the natural landscape. They talk about the Scottish Highlands as a beautiful place, as a place that gives the people there a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, a sense of pride, a kind of wholeness that, especially as you start getting into industrialization, people are going to start feeling lacking. Of course, we also mentioned Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There's obviously a kind of naturalist element to it. It's a question of science versus nature and the soul. But it's worth noting that this new story can also be read as the story of a loss of individualism. The new man, represented by the monster, is strong and intelligent, and one could actually argue that the monster is very rational. But he still feels isolated and self-hating because he's been thrown out by his creator. And so there's this sense of psychological turmoil, of loss, of emotion. And that really hits at the critique that Romanticism is making of the Enlightenment. That we've gone too far down the path of rationality. There's this other side of the human coin that we really need to recognize and celebrate. Finally, the last sort of area that I want to talk about is Romantic painting. The Romantic style will, again, emphasize this idea of emotion, this idea of spirituality. A great example of this is by the Spanish painter Francisco Goya of Spain, who kind of reacted to David, who's painting all of these sort of pro-revolution paintings, these pro-patriotic paintings. Isn't it great? Aren't we bringing reason and rationality to the rest of the continent of Europe? But Goya's experience living in Spain is much different. Basically, as we kind of hinted at in the Napoleon episode, one of the things that happens is Napoleon ends up turning on his erstwhile Spanish allies. He invades them, and he goes to put his brother on the throne in 1808. When he does this, there is a rebellion by local Spaniards because they don't like the idea of being ruled by Napoleon. And so this painting that Goya makes, called the 3rd of May, 1808, it's actually painted in 1814, this painting depicts what we would call today a war crime. It is the execution of a number of Spanish sort of freedom fighters by French soldiers. And the way that Goya positions the painting, the very center of it, you can see the face of a man who's about to be shot. It highlights the emotions that are being expressed by the Spanish victims as they are being killed. And while that might not strike you or I as being very surprising, for contemporaries, this is shocking. This is radically different than the usual take on war. If you think about most paintings of war, either you get kind of paintings of individuals performing heroic deeds, or you get the kind of global picture where the armies are colliding, but it's not bloody, it's not gory. You don't see the destructive side of war in these kind of heroic paintings. But Goya, as a Romantic painter, will break through that and say, look, I want to show you the psychological side of what's going on. Another painter that we should definitely mention when we talk about Romantic art is my personal favorite painter, Caspar David Friedrich, who is a German landscape painter who's mainly working in the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. There's a lot of things that he does that are amazing. One of the most important is his emphasis on the power of nature. And so perhaps one of Friedrich's most impressive works is this painting from 1810 called Monk by the Sea. And if you've never seen it, I really recommend that you Google it, because it really drives home again the kind of psychological state of many people that are involved in the Romantic movement. The painting itself is basically this picture of a monk, and he's on the beach and he's looking at the ocean and he's looking at the sky. But the monk is incredibly small. The monk is basically maybe, I want to say about an inch or two tall on this massive canvas that's about 3.5 feet by 5.5 feet. So you can barely see the monk as he blurs in against the sky and against the ocean. And this is such a profound romantic statement, right? The idea that we as human beings, we're not conquering nature. We're not masters of nature. We're just this little speck against these broader forces. Think about the sky. Think about the ocean. The ocean isn't something we can control even today, really. It's powerful. It's massive. You versus the ocean. I mean, you're such a small thing in comparison. So this again gets really into the romantic mindset, especially the idea of the power of nature. Another painting that Friedrich did in 1824 that really kind of bears this out is called Sea of Ice. And so it's basically looking at this Arctic landscape, and basically the pack ice is closed in and trapped a ship and completely shattered it. And so all you see are basically these massive ice formations and a couple of little remnants here and there of the ship that is no longer in existence. It's been pulverized by the frozen sea. Friedrich's stuff is just amazing. A couple others that are great. One of his most famous paintings is Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog from 1818. It kind of shows sort of this individual, kind of like him, from the backside, and he's climbed a mountain and he's just looking out at all of the clouds and all of the glory and the power and the mystery of nature. And so again, you kind of get this romantic sense, this wholeness, this connection that we as human beings have that we don't want to over-rationalize. We don't want to think about it. You want to go to the beach and sit down and hear the wind and hear the water and almost taste the salt in the air, and don't think about it. Just let it wash over you. You want to go to a cemetery, not just to go see a grave of someone that you know, but just to go among the ruins even and just contemplate it. Go at dusk, go in the dawn, feel the light or see the light as it's changing, as it's creating these illuminations of the sky. This is the essence of what the Romantic movement is supposed to be. All right, well, I could go on and on about Romantic art. Unfortunately, I haven't really even touched on Romantic music yet. Some of the names from the 19th century are all about Romantic art. We're talking about people like Friedrich Chopin. Chopin, if you go and listen to Chopin, it moves you. It's not just, okay, here's people prancing around on the stage, they're dancing, whatever. It's emotional music. You can put it on today and even feel the force of the emotion in the music. Interesting enough, Moses Mendelssohn's grandchildren, Fanny and Felix Mendelssohn, became very famous composers in their own rights. We have people from all across Europe. We have people like Rossini from Italy. We have Franz Schubert from Germany. As the Romantic movement, especially in music, continues to grow and build, you get names like Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Antonin Dvorak, Richard Strauss, and of course the arch-Romantic composer Richard Wagner, or Richard Wagner, if you want to anglicize it. So artistically speaking, one could say that the Romantic reaction proved to be more enduring than the neoclassical moment, which doesn't really outlive Napoleon by much. Yes, you could argue in architecture it does. When people are building, kind of state buildings up until really the 20th century, a lot of times they're using that kind of neoclassical architectural style. When you go to an old bank, the old bank almost always looks in a neoclassical style. But in terms of music, in terms of painting, things like that, the Romantic movement far outlasts neoclassicism, and one could argue that its roots later on stretch into things like Impressionism, later on things like Cubism, and even into modern art today. More broadly speaking, the impact of Romanticism is hard to divorce from another critical 19th century development, which is the rise of the nation and of national consciousness. In our regular podcast series, we'll discuss the ways that institutions, politics, economics, school system especially, how all these things help people learn not only their national identity, but to arrive at a place where those identities became more important than any others. But people do not learn things passively. They learn through their history, they learn through their culture, which they experience in art, literature, media, and movies. Kids today, they grow up learning values not just because someone told them that in school or in church or synagogue or at the mosque or wherever. They learn that through the stories that they consume, that they immerse themselves in, that they read or they watch or they listen to. The Romantic movement that began in the late 18th century unlocked or spurred popular interest in the national past. It awakened, one could say, a desire to create the collective memories that form the core of national belonging. And so in this respect, our lecture today has not just been about art or about a reaction to the Enlightenment, but it helps us understand in a spiritual way how people came to embrace the nation as the central form of identity in the 19th century. To find out more about the consequences of this development, I hope you'll join us for future episodes as we take history off the page.